and now we have inflation. And so we've taken a look at inflation based on its components. As we're starting to see the signs of inflation starting to moderate, and I think we expect it to moderate throughout 2022. But take us through the differences between commodities and the reopening basket here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the Fed doing what they were doing resulted in inflation, but only in asset prices, right? Mm-hmm. So now we're talking about goods prices, where we're seeing inflation now with the reopening of the economy. So taking the core CPI basket, breaking it up into buckets that we think make a lot of sense given where the economy is in its reopening cycle. So the first bucket, that purple line, we call that the reopening bucket. So those are things that represent only 5% of the core CPI basket. So those are used cars, hotels and motels, airline fares, car and truck rental. These things, when we got into summer of 2021, were up 40% year over year. And the only reason why that is justified is because we know now in hindsight, it's much harder to reopen the economy than it is to shut it down. And so used cars, for example, every single rental car company is scrambling to buy used cars because they had basically offloaded their entire fleet. And so you get a demand shock. So that was the first leg of the inflation narrative. The other leg that pretty much followed right along is commodities. Those are in orange. So there are commodities that are in the core basket. They're not food and energy, but they're other commodities. They represent about 25% of core CPI. Those are up close to 10% year over year. In our view, you will probably start to see some moderation there, just because a lot of this has been fueled by supply chain disruptions and a lack of investment in increased productive capacity for commodities. So we think there's potential that this rate of change stays positive, but maybe moderates a little bit from here. So that's the second part of inflation. And we're talking here over sort of a 12-month time horizon. Think about commodities over a much longer term time horizon. We think there's still potential for a boom super cycle in commodities. So perhaps taking a breather over the next 12 months a little bit. And then the last bucket is the long-term bucket. So this is almost 50% of the core CPI basket. These are primarily rent measures and then the cost of medical services. So those are up about 3.3%. So you think about these different types of inflation all tied to the reopening of the economy. And when we say something like inflation is going to moderate this year, what is that going to look like? Well, most likely it looks like the reopening bucket, that purple line, should come down pretty aggressively. Perhaps even move negative by the end of the year. You think about used cars as a perfect example. It's quite possible that by the time we get to the end of the year, used car prices are down year over year slightly. They're still going to be high relative to 2-3 years ago, right? But perhaps the rate of change comes negative or moves to zero. That would, if we see that will sort of reinforce our idea that inflation should be moderating. That would be the first thing. Commodities probably just cooling off a bit. And then the last thing that we'd need to see is the long-term bucket, more so just stabilizing. A lot of this is baked in the cake. I mean, you look at what's going on in rents representing a huge portion of that long-term bucket. They follow housing prices with an 18-month lag. So over the past 18 months, since the COVID pandemic, housing prices have gone up dramatically. And so rents will now start to move up. So those are going to be moving up. What we need to see is, the long-term bucket sort of moderating. And you put all these shades and time horizons of inflation and different types of inflation together, and hopefully what you see is the overall core CPI number by the end of the year gets somewhere in the low 3s. That, in our view, is moderating. I mean, right now we're around 5.
Right, and the increase in rents, so I now have to pay more for my housing. What goods does that immediately affect in this basket?
Right, direct knock-on effect to the other baskets. Because, if the cost of used cars, airfare goes up, I can avoid those things. It's not a problem. I avoid those, it's not going to impact spending in other areas necessarily. But if the cost of my rents go up, well, now I'm probably not going to buy a new car. I'm not going to move out into the bigger house or whatever the case may be. I'm not going to spend more on these discretionary items. So as rents start to move up, that should actually help cool other items in the basket, because you just have less money to spend on everything else, assuming rents are rising faster than wages, which in most instances, probably this year, that might be the case. Rents could be rising faster than wages.
Yeah, interesting to see how it's going to play out and the impact on people throughout 2022. So